I guess we are live now. Yeah. Good morning and welcome to Living My Promise Saturday Masterclass live session. Sorry for the confusion. There was some issue and we couldn't go live at 11 a.m. Apologies for that. Today we have with us Moomal Mehta. Good morning, Moomal. Thank you
Morning.
for joining this masterclass session. Yeah. So Moomal Mehta is founder at Crossover Catalyst and she's an IIM Kolkata alumnus. Crossover Catalyst helps non-profit organizations or development sector organizations find talent pool from the corporate sector, as well as she also helps corporate professionals, transition into roles in non-profit organizations. Let me also tell you a little bit about Living My Promise initiative. As you are all aware, Living My Promise this is an initiative for those with a net worth of about 1 crore, where you come forward and pledge 50% of your wealth to give back for causes that you believe in, either in your lifetime or in your wills. So far, we have 43 Indians from various parts of the country, amazing individuals who have signed up and are in the process of fulfilling their pledge by giving away their own personal net wealth for various philanthropic causes that they believe in. We look forward to seeing more people join in this initiative. And let's begin asking Moomal about the session and take it forward. Hi Moomal, how is life during COVID?
So life between COVID is, shall we say, confined. It's been really an extraordinary few weeks. I think the predominant things that are going through my mind is, this lurch between gratitude that, the people close to me, friends, family are all fine, but also this great distress at what is going on in our country and to see so many people in so much difficulty. So I think that I would say is the state of mind at the moment.
Yeah. Let's hope that the good times are ahead of us very soon. And thank you for agreeing to do this Facebook Live session with us. We're really glad that you're here, and we are waiting for a few more audience to join.
Can you turn up your volume a little bit, Sushant, so I can hear you a bit better?
Yes. Are you able to hear me better?
Yes, a little better, yeah.
Okay. So, Moomal, let me ask you the first question. Tell us a little bit about your own journey and why you ended up starting Crossover Catalyst.
Yeah, sure. So it's a fairly straightforward one at the beginning. Did an MBA, went to work at Citibank, did a bunch of sales, marketing, and operations roles in India and elsewhere in the world. And around the time I turned 40, began to experience a little bit of a declining learning curve, this urge at the personal level to think about what impact I was having on the wider world. And just around the time that I was framing some of these questions, not entirely formed in my head, I encountered a nonprofit organization called Asia Society and moved, in very short order with a very large pay cut to that organization. And for me, I think that was a pretty important pivot because I realized that the kind of skills that people with our background and pedigree and work experience have are actually very fungible, even though you may not know very much about the domain. This particular organization was working in the area of arts, culture, politics, policy, which was an area of personal interest, but I had no expertise in. And to find myself being able to be effective in an organization where I knew relatively little in domain I had no expertise in was instructive. I think the second thing that happened was that I expanded my network in the social sector. So encountered a number of organizations doing incredible work in a variety of ways. And the point that led me to Crossover Catalyst was the fact that every time I went to meet a social sector organization, very quickly the question would come up about, so how can we hire people with your background and experience in our work? And simultaneously, I also had networks on the corporate side, and a lot of people were quite intrigued by what I was doing in my new world. And I felt that there was need for an intermediary that could connect the two, people who were looking to do something different, more impactful, and organizations who were working to solve some of India's most complicated and difficult problems, and who were looking for passionate leaders with high levels of competence to do that. And so that was really the genesis of Crossover Catalyst. It lay at the intersection of my experience, my networks, and that's the work that I have done for the last 3.5 years.
Moving on to the next question. Before I can move on to the next question, viewers who are watching, if you have any questions you need to ask Moomal Mehta, please feel free to post your questions in the comment section of the live video on LivingMyPromise page. Moomal, I have another question for you. The topic being your time or your money, which is more valuable? Let's say, for example, if I'm a senior corporate executive earning 60 lakhs a year and can donate 15 lakhs a year, is it more valuable, or is it more valuable if I join the social sector full time, perhaps at a 36 lakh pay and don't donate? What do you think is a good situation?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, right? I actually will pivot the question and not answer it maybe entirely directly. I think that giving is a moral imperative. And giving can be in many different ways, right? I don't believe that, I think you can give by volunteering time. I think you can give by donating money. I think that you can, obviously, I think you can give by pivoting professionally to a corporate career. And I don't think there is a hierarchy in giving in all of these ways. As long as you're giving, as long as you're socially minded, socially engaged, and giving time or money, I think that is a good thing. I think that what is critical in this is to see what you can do sustainably. So rather than figuring out whether the answer is to give time or give money, the question is really, what can you give over time? So if you make a professional pivot, is that a well-considered move? Are you joining an organization where you can have real impact? Are you committed to staying the course with that organization for 2-3 years to see a line of impact through? Or are you going to engage with it for a few months and then decide that this is not for you? Or are you going to give money to a social sector organization who then creates programs and becomes dependent on your funding and then not continue that? So I think the ability to sustain an effort, whether it is volunteering time or it is volunteering money or it is engaging professionally, is more important than the exact thing that you volunteer. That is a function of what works best for you in how you're placed in your life.
Next question to you is, what kind of roles can those wanting to cross over from the corporate world look for? What skills are valuable in the social sector according to you?
Yeah, so the straightforward answer to that question is that all the skills that corporate professionals bring, whether they are leadership skills that include managing stakeholders, setting a strategic agenda, managing and leading teams, engaging the wider ecosystem, or they are specific operating and managerial skills like identifying and fixing problems, having plan A and B and C for execution, or they are domain skills, HR, communications, fundraising, finance. Those are all skills that are valuable in different social sector contexts. You will notice that in this response, there's no mention of actual social sector experience, whether even as a volunteer or, as part of an organization, because I'm a huge believer in the fungibility of skills. I think if you have the right learning orientation and the right mindset, you actually don't need. And what has always been astonishing to me is that when corporate professionals are transitioning, let's say from banking to an FMCG company, or from an FMCG company to a consulting firm, then these questions aren't asked. But the questions become relevant somehow when the domain is the social sector. And that's the thing that we are trying to challenge in the work that we do.
But don't you think there is some sort of domain knowledge of the social sector that is required for people to transition?
Well, in the work that we've done in the last 3.5 years or so, I would say that domain knowledge is required for very specific positions in the social sector, right? So if you're running an on-ground rural development program, if you're running an effort for nutrition, if you're running an effort on sanitation, if you're running an effort on communicable diseases, that's very much ground oriented and requires a certain set of technical knowledge, then yes, I would say that for those specific positions, maybe some domain expertise, maybe some educational training is required. But by and large, and I would say that would be, I don't have accurate numbers, but I would say maybe that would be a small portion of the jobs in the social sector. With very general skills, you can still be very, very effective in most social sector organizations. Provided, of course, you have the ability to learn about the domain and the intent. So we've had, sorry, just to give you examples, we've had people who've transitioned, for example, from FMCG companies to an edtech organization. We've had an individual, even within the social sector, running a very large health initiative, who transitioned last year to lead a multinational organization's skilling foundation. So I believe, and I have seen in my work, that these skills are extremely fungible, and with the right attitude and learning orientation, the adaptability is very possible.
Yeah. So we have questions coming up from our audience. Sonal Chabria is asking, you said you joined at a huge pay cut. What would make someone do that? So morally, if one needs to give the social sector, you can give a check sustainably. What would tempt someone from the corporate sector to join the social sector?
So that's a great question, Sonal. And I think that, the answers are at many levels. I obviously believe that it has to be sustainable with the sort of life that the individual is looking at living. So if I look at the transitions that we have helped orchestrate, we have found people who have reached a level of financial security. And, this could be by their mid-30s, it could be by their mid-40s. And they say that, I'm too young to retire. I'm in a position in my life where I no longer need to work for money. And I'm still looking to make a contribution to the world. And that's why I want to transition to the social sector. And the compensation is not an important consideration anymore. So there's that subset of people. But what I've been very excited about more recently is just the number of young people, people in their late 20s, early 30s, who grew up maybe a generation after us, who at the relatively early stages in their careers are saying that, we are unhappy with the way things are in the world. Inequity bothers us deeply. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that I have a MBA from a top business school, and what I want to do is work in a consulting or investment banking job and make X. I'm very happy making a difference in this way, in this particular way, and making maybe 20% of X or 40% of X. So I think that is a trend that I'm honestly pleasantly surprised by, but that bodes very well for people in the career. So to illustrate with an example, we had a young woman, a single woman who came to us, and she was, she was in a PE firm and was making in the high 50s in annual compensation. And she accepted about a 50% pay cut to work in an education nonprofit that she felt very compelled by, and where she had volunteered time. And so she knew the organization very well. So I wouldn't say that it's for everyone. It's a very, very tough decision. But the great gift of the 1.3 billion is that you can always find people who will do that, and we do find them.
Yeah. So Aarti Madhusudan has a question for you. What are the top 3 things that you have learned, skills, attitude, knowledge, from being a volunteer yourself?
So, it's very interesting to ask this because volunteering is a very, very complex thing in the context of social sector organizations. And I will say, at the risk maybe of being slightly provocative, that not a lot of social sector organizations know how to use volunteers well. I have seen a few that can use volunteers well, but by and large, volunteers are not used very well in the sector. And I think it's down to 2 or 3 things. I think volunteering is not structured, so it tends to be sporadic. So, people will find that, they're on a sabbatical, so they look for a neighborhood organization, they will invest time for some time. And then the moment they are again committed to a full-time job, then there are restrictions on that time. I think it's important to understand that when we volunteer time to a social sector organization, that organization is counting on us for a certain type of contribution. And not being able to sustain that contribution of time and to contribute to the solving of that problem is very difficult. It makes things very difficult for the organization who's counting on that outcome. So I think where it is well structured, where the outcomes are very clearly defined, and where the mutual understanding of, you don't have to work all the time in the office, you can work flexibly from home, you can talk to stakeholders on my behalf if that's required. If all of those things are in place, then volunteering is set up for success. But if the idea is that I have 2 free hours and in a day, and I might have it on Thursday next week, and it might be on Sunday afternoon the following week, then that doesn't really work. So for volunteering to work, it has to be sustained, and it has to be driven by mutual accountability and impact.
We have another question from Mr. Amit Chandra. He's asking you, what level do you believe is the most appropriate for talent to cross over from corporate to social sector? And what do people need to forget the most to be successful in this world?
Those are my favorite questions. And I'm going to take the second one first, which is about what needs to be forgotten. I think that there are 3 things in our mind that are absolutely critical for people who are looking to cross over. I think the first is learning agility. If you have the intent and attitude to understand that there are some things you do really well, particularly if you've been successful in the corporate domain, you've built networks, you've demonstrated a track record of success, there are obviously some things you know really, really well. But there's also a whole world out there about which maybe you don't know very much. And knowing that is very, very important. And that's the sort of unlearning piece. Knowing that when you walk into, if you've previously led a large insurance company in India, checking that identity in when you walk through the door of a large health nonprofit is actually the most important thing to do. because you are there to learn. You bring a lot of skills. That is why you're in that position. But many of those skills may not be relevant in a new domain. And I'll give you a very interesting example. We facilitated the transition of a very senior leader, I won't name the person or the organization, into a huge and very well-known and well-regarded educational institution. And he said to me that for the first 3 months, I am going to keep my mouth closed and my ears open. Because I'm very successful in a previous domain. I've got a personal profile, lots of people know me, etc., etc. But this is a world about which I really need to learn. And I thought that was such a beautiful way to enter a new world, a very humble way to do that, to acknowledge that I'm successful, I know a lot, but there's many things I don't know as well. So I think that is very important. And I would like to contrast that actually with somebody who came to us about a year or so ago. And the person was looking to make a transition, very senior, very well-regarded corporate leader, held many important positions, etc., etc. And we were talking about what a transition could look like, what opportunities might be there specifically, etc., etc. And I described a few, and then the person said to me, I have a feeling that, within about 3 to 6 months, I'm going to know more than the founders of these organizations. So, what do you think I'll do after that? And it was that one comment that told me that this person is probably needing some fine-tuning in the thought process before they are ready for a transition. And it's actually very instructive because I did follow that individual and the person did end up transitioning. And it has been a very, very difficult transition for the organization as well as for the individual. So I think that is the single most important thing to bear in mind as you transition from an unlearning perspective.
Moomal, I don't think you answered. What level do you believe is the most appropriate for talent to cross over from corporate to social sector?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for reminding me. So I think the need is everywhere. The level is a matter of finding an opportunity that works for you, which is also consistent with the city in which you want to live, the kind of impact that you define for yourself. Is it a skilling intervention you're called for? Is it an education? Is it an air quality? There's so very many different types of organizations. And as I said, the need is across levels. So it's a matter of finding what works for you and to investigating whether in that particular role you're well positioned for impact in the way that you define it for yourself.
Yeah. Bhumi has a question for you. She's asking, what is the level of pay cut you expect? How does it affect you personally to not be able to afford your current lifestyle or dependent on someone else financially?
So again, a very interesting question, and I'll illustrate it with the example of, one of the first few transitions we facilitated. It's obviously a very, very difficult issue. And, somebody that I've known for a very long time, very senior corporate professional, reached out to me relatively early in our journey as part of Crossover Catalyst. And, he said that I'm very keen to transition. This is a moment in my life. I am looking at, I'm very clear that the work that I've done is in my past and I'm going to transition. And, we were able to locate many senior roles for him. They were all, very, very compelling, well positioned for impact. Many organizations felt that he would make a huge difference to them and their work. The catch was that almost every organization was offering him between 50 and 70% of his current compensation. And this is a person who has a young family. And I was asking myself the question that I don't want really to be in a situation where a family's trajectory is changing in terms of where if they can go on vacation, how they travel, where they go out to eat. I find that a very big burden to bear. So we actually worked with a coach in that instance who helped the individual clarify his own thinking, to check that his intent was something that would be sustainable over time. It wasn't just, I'm having a midlife crisis, or I have a terrible boss, or I'm not getting along with my board, or one of those things. And, that particular story, I'm very happy to report, went well. The person led an organization, very large Indian nonprofit, very successfully, and has now been chosen to lead another organization in India. So he's doing very well. But in general, this question is a very tough one, and it needs to be answered at the level of the individual themselves. To some extent, it is important to understand the fact that compensations in the social sector are not just structurally lower. There is also very limited wealth creation upside. So sometimes there are organizations, startups come to mind where, you may not have a very high compensation, but there is a wealth creation opportunity. In the social sector, that doesn't exist. So you need to be very, very clear which trajectory you're on, and the fact that you can sustain that trajectory over time. And if this is not the right time for you to take a compensation cut, if you are somebody who's considering a transition to the social sector, this is not a good time for you to take a compensation cut, then figure out another way to volunteer time. You can, as I said, you can find a structured opportunity to volunteer. You can join a small organization's board. You can donate money to a worthy cause. These are all great ways to give back, and keep it in mind. And when you're more ready in your life stage to transition, then that's when is a good time to transition. I'm not a big fan of jumping in with huge pay cuts because you're very highly passionate. It has to be a well-considered long-term decision.
Yeah. So Mona Bhatia has a question. She has experience in the corporate world and is interested in transitioning to the social sector space. So she's asking, how does one take this forward?
Yeah. So, Mona, I think there are a few different types of things. I think you need, most people who are looking to transition need to kind of build an understanding of the sector. Try and read as much as you possibly can. Try and identify what cause areas you're excited by. There are various resources on the internet. There have recently been some books that have come out. There are terrific online resources that can help you really understand what the landscape of the social sector looks like and what might be a good place for you to land. There are some training programs in the sector that you could go through as a sort of immersive experience to understand what sorts of opportunities are there, who the key players are, who the leaders are that inspire you. That's a great way to do it as well. There are intermediaries with whom you can have conversations. There are, I know, job portals as well online. Those are all great ways to give back. So I would say build your understanding and access the intermediaries that are facilitating this transition.
Yeah. Monika Datta has a question. She's asking, what would it take to make the social sector more self-sufficient and hence sustainable? What if more charities were run as social enterprises and made money while doing good? What are the barriers to this in India?
Yeah, that's a great question, Monica. And that's really been something that at a very, very broad level, not been figured out very well in India, definitely, and maybe perhaps even globally. The indefinite philanthropic support model obviously has its limitation because philanthropy is not infinite. But I think the good news is that there are a lot of young and other non-young people who are looking at the social enterprise model very, very carefully. There are exciting startups in sanitation, in health, in education, in governance and art that are looking at sustainable models that solve social problems with a business engine attached. So while I'm not an expert and I couldn't tell you what the barriers to that growth are, I would say that by and large the microfinance industry has managed to figure it out. They have been able to address the last mile access to credit with a sustainable, accessible, scaled up business model. That is unfortunately yet to happen in many other domains. I would say to some extent, maybe even on the skilling side, there have been interventions of that nature.
Siddharth has a question. Are there any social sector initiatives on reskilling the young workforce come out of, by and large, redundant educational vocational training, providing industrial apprenticeship?
Sorry, can you say that again? I couldn't hear you very clearly.
Oh, sorry. So Siddharth has a question. He's asking us, are there any social sector initiatives on reskilling the young workforce who come out of, by and large, redundant educational vocational training, providing industrial apprenticeship?
Yeah, again, a great question, because I think a lot of people are thinking very hard about skilling and vocational training as a much more direct route to financial viability than other models. And there are a bunch of incredibly exciting organizations that are working in the skilling space. There are people who are working with school dropouts to find a way to give them access to skills that can help them become either micro entrepreneurs or get jobs. There are people who are working on people who are more to make them more digital ready. They may have any sort of schooling or undergrad degree even sometimes, but giving them digital skills then enables them to kind of sustain jobs in the new economy in a sense. There is a wonderful organization in Calcutta who's doing that nationally. There are organizations who are looking at demand aggregation. So they're saying, okay, it looks like there's a great need for primary frontline healthcare workers, for example, and they are aggregating the demand there, recruiting individuals who can be trained to meet that demand, designing a curriculum, delivering that curriculum, and connecting them to jobs. So there is a whole slew of very, very exciting models in the skilling and vocational training space.
This is one of my favorite questions from Venkat Krishnan. He's asking, why don't we see enough reverse flow of talent from the social sector to the corporate? They bring skills like innovation, flexibility, ability to operate with severe constraints, etc.
Yeah, I on the whole, Venkat, of course, the most provocative question of all. I see that, honestly, I've lived in the corporate world for many years, as you know. I feel that the corporate recruiting process has some limitations. And in some sense, the ability to read a resume and to look at the underlying skills is not something that a lot of people are able to invest time in doing. And that is actually also one of the barriers that results in the reverse flow, right? So if you're let's say you're an education nonprofit and you're running a network of public schools and you're looking for a school leader, you're looking for a principal for one of your schools, are you likely to hire somebody who's previously worked in a consulting firm or an FMCG company? Probably not. You're likely to hire somebody who's been in education. But I believe that somebody who's run a very large enterprise has many of the core skills that could be required to run something as complex as a school. And the same thing applies on the corporate side. the tendency is to look for like-to-like experience. It's the safe thing to do. It's the easy thing to do. You really don't want to stretch and understand whether this would be something, you can make work. It's a much riskier move. I think, Venkat, where this effort has worked very well is at the board level. So when the regulations with independent board members kind of changed, I've seen a fairly decent flow of social sector leaders into corporate boards. And I think that is a really, really inspiring and encouraging sign, because that's the level at which strategic agendas get set, and bringing that voice into the boardroom is, I think, a very welcome development.
Do you think this would have happened without the CSR law?
I mean, I think the CSR law is not necessarily entirely connected to the board movement. The CSR law has done the job of channeling a lot of philanthropic money into the sector. That's how I see that. But I think it's not necessarily connected to the independent board positions.
Yeah. Siddharth Bandari is asking a question. He's saying, in post-COVID world, can professionals volunteer remotely on a part-time basis?
Yeah, I mean, we are all working remotely, right? Yes. Volunteering, as I said earlier, is a reasonably complex business. It has to be set up very, very right. But I think the short answer is yes, you can. The piece to be figured out is if you can find an organization that can make good use of your experience and agree on a set of outcomes so that it's rewarding for the organization and rewarding for the volunteer. So if you can do that, then I think it's a good thing to do.
Yeah. So we have a question from Archana Tomar. She's asking, why is one expected to automatically work at a smaller pay in social sector or than in corporate sector? Considering that working in social sector require equal or more, and most of the time multitasking. You have to hustle, and what is required, and your mental, emotional, aspirational level is at its highest. Not to undermine any other sector, but stakes of success and life impact is higher in social sector, but we don't value it enough to compensate accordingly. Why is that?
That is such a great question. Why should doing good be poorly paid? That is the fundamental question, right? And the answer is at 2 or 3 levels. I think the first is that somebody had asked earlier, that social sector organizations are dependent on philanthropic money, right? They are not self-sustainable. They don't have sources of revenue. So a small nonprofit can only work when donors fund its programs. And like most donors, me included, feel that if I'm giving a certain amount of money, then I want as much of that money to be possible to be deployed against the end beneficiary, right? Whether it is for the education or for an improved health outcome or whatever it is. But I want as much of my money as possible to go to that. Very, very few, only the most evolved donors will pay for a terrific manager to run that initiative, right? So that provides a little bit of a natural cap on compensations in the sector. I would say that I see a change. I see early signs of change on this in the sector. I feel like many more organizations are pushing themselves, working with very mature and thoughtful donors to increase the level of pay so that they can get high quality leaders and managers into specific roles. I do see that trend. It is changing. We are not nearly where we need to be, but we are in a much, much better place, I would say, than even 2 or 3 years ago. The understanding that if you pay well, you can get really great talent, and that talent can make a can have a multiplier effect on outcomes is, I think, beginning to be understood by many people in the sector.
Shavita Sharma is asking, in your experience, which are the areas in non-profits where people have made the transition, from corporate sector, health, education, etc. Is there a pattern to that?
So, Sharita, we've seen a pretty wide-ranging set of transitions. We've seen transitions into grassroots nonprofit organizations into leadership positions. We've seen transitions in intermediaries where people are taking on sort of leadership or functional leadership roles. We've also seen transitions into the professional services firms, the consulting firms, the impact investors, etc. So I would say that it's a pretty wide range of transitions. I don't think there is a particular area that I would say actually that people are more domain focused. So people respond mainly to education or mainly to health or to skilling, depending on what their internal drivers are. But I would say that because philanthropy is about 70% or so of Indian philanthropy is directed in some way or form to the education sector, I would say that our own transitions have sort of generally reflected that pattern. Maybe not at the 70% level, but 50-60%.
Venkat has a follow-up question. Is asking, can you give 1-2 examples of social sector leaders who have been taken on corporate boards?
So there is a gentleman who has joined the, I think he's joined the Piramal Enterprises board. And I think there are a couple of people who are joining other boards. Venkat, I'm sorry, I'm blanking. I don't have specific examples, but I'll be happy to share with you. And I'll tell you where this conversation even came to my mind. There is a leader of a very large social sector consulting firm who told me that he was invited to a couple of boards, but he was considering the conflict of interest because some of the foundations of those corporates he's also serving. And then he gave me some examples of people who have made the transition. So I'm sorry, I can't think of any immediate examples, but I do know that has begun. I'll share them with you later.
Yeah. Sumer from Dubai is asking, that should social awareness be built ground up starting from schools to develop future leaders and becoming good world citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely critical. I think to build an understanding of privilege and to know that many of us have won the birth lottery and can sit in the comfort of our homes in COVID times when so many others don't have that is something that everyone should have a much deeper understanding of. There are programs in many schools now, many schools in India across curriculums that incorporate social service as part of their school curriculum. I know the school that my children go to, they have to set 2 hours each week to volunteer time at the high school level for different causes. They can choose a cause area that is of interest. So I believe that is something that is growing and expanding and should be amplified and encouraged. I would say that parents need to be supportive of their children who have fabulous degrees and fabulous experience and could really get any job in the world and choose to work with organizations that are making a direct difference to people's lives.
Yeah. Siddharth Bora has a question. He's asking, how do corporates think beyond conventional ways to shape their CSR strategies? How do you see it evolving?
Yeah, so it's a really tough one. I think the most important thing as far as corporate CSR is concerned is that it has to be on the CEO's agenda. The same level of management rigor that is brought to client development, to client delivery, to strategic sort of vision setting, that has to be brought to giving as well. And that can only happen when it is driven by the top leadership. It cannot happen without that. That's why we are very particular on, we often get asked by corporate CSR organizations to help them find a CEO or a CXO or whatever. And one of the things that we look for is how deeply involved, how much of the CEO's time does the foundation take? Is it, somewhere in the hierarchy of the organization? Is it under corporate communications? Is it under HR? Is it a side function? Is it a photo opportunity for the annual report? Or is this corporate thinking very seriously about giving? That is a very important signal to us on how to create transitions in that zone. So I think it has to be on the CEO's agenda. That's the first thing. And if it is on the CEO's agenda, then there are a number of organizations that can help you be strategic with your giving for the company. They can help you identify cause areas. They can help you identify nonprofits within those cause areas. They can help create volunteering opportunities, which are more structured, more impact oriented. All of those things are possible. But I think it starts with being on the CEO's agenda.
Well, Rajat is asking, one of the reasons that social sectors pay less is because the impact is not measured sharply enough. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is true. There is a reasonably long way to go on the impact measurement side. Some organizations do it really well, others not so well. So the value proposition with which they can go to donors is not sharp. And corporate managers or very large philanthropic donors do respond to very sharply articulated impact messages. There's no question about that. So there's a way to go on that. There are intermediaries who are developing, even in the Indian philanthropy space, who look at monitoring and evaluation metrics and are building better solutions and measurement around that. That is happening. That being said, I don't think that the lack of I think impact is a following criteria. We need to first do things, then we can measure impact, right? And to do things, you need people. And so, so from a transition perspective, I think we need to bring high quality, high pedigree leaders who are passionate about making a difference into the sector, so that then we can measure the impact of their work.
Yeah. My friend Rishabh Lalani asks you, the problem with corporate leaders shifting to the social sector is that they lack the politics and political understanding to shift power. They bring a management lens, but in more ways harm the goal of social change. What is your take on this? Say side.
Okay, so Rishabh, I mean, I think to some extent, I would agree with you. I think that there is a little bit of edginess that an alpha corporate professional could bring into the social sector, provided the person decides to transition to the social sector. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I don't think that asking a tough question about impact, asking a tough question about should we be running program X or program Y, should we not be measuring our people better in terms of professional development practices. I don't think that those are difficult questions. Those are difficult questions, but I don't think they are unfair questions. And if that is the nature of the individual to hold processes, procedures, and impact accountability, then I think that's a very good thing. To bring politics into it, I mean, I don't think that social sector organizations don't have politics. I think people are the same everywhere, and my advice to people who are seriously considering transitions is that if you think you're going to meet, on the whole, a different mix of people in the social sector relative to the people you met in the corporate world, that's absolutely not true. There is the same mix of movers and shakers, the same mix of authentic people, the same mix of people who want to get ahead, the same mix of people who want to send the first email out to the boss. They all exist in the same mix, even in the social sector. So that should not be the reason to transition should not be that you're going to somehow meet only well-intentioned and passionate and kind and generous people. The mix is the same.
Ashutosh Tyagi is asking, would you suggest volunteering before considering shifting full time? Reason being, many triggers to shift are because of whether dissatisfaction or feeling of being stuck many have with their current corporate jobs rather than a strong pull of the sector or appreciation for the job in social sector.
No, that's a very important point, Ashutosh, and it's a very important way in which we work to unpack the motivations of the people we work with, right? To understand whether a transition is going to be sustainable or not. Are you leaving your current job and exploring a social sector opportunity because your industry is going through a downturn? Is it because you have an unkind boss? Is it because you have some other, you don't see potential to grow to the next level? Or is it that you genuinely believe that you're at a stage and age in your life where a professional transition to doing impact work would make the most sense? So it has to be, there can be push factors. There's no problem with the push factors, but the pull factors have to be stronger. That is very much true. Volunteering is a good idea. Again, with the caveats that I mentioned earlier, that it needs to be structured, it needs to be outcome focused, and it needs to be consistent and sustainable over time. Volunteers also go in the other direction. Volunteers take one look at a non-AC office and say that I can't do this. I can't do this.
Yeah. Manish Gosalia is asking, any books or blogs available on leadership that cover the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you my favorite recommendation. It is actually, for me, I called the author, who's a good friend of ours, to thank him for writing the textbook on transitions. It's called A Stranger Truth. It's written by a gentleman who ran the Gates Foundation in India and was instrumental in creating and delivering the Avahan program that led to that made such a huge difference to HIV in India, the trajectory of HIV in India. It's called A Stranger Truth by Ashok Alexander. I think that's a really great book. There is another wonderful book about the power of giving. It's called The Billionaire Who Wasn't. It's about this gentleman called Chuck Feeney, who's the best known, who's the largest giver, one of the largest givers in the history of the world. He was the founder of DFS, Duty Free. And he gave away most of his fortune. And I read the book and I was so moved because, the foundation he set up, the people that were hired to run that foundation would fly first class on the same aircraft where Chuck Feeney and his wife would be crammed in the backseat with their knees to their chins. That was the generosity of this person. He would happily travel coach to save money to give, while the people that were working for the foundation through which he was routing his money were in the front of that same plane. So which is a good way to kind of bring everything together, right? The generosity and philanthropy that enables impactful work to happen, as well as some of the challenges around utilization and impact.
Yeah. I think I have one last question, one or two questions for you. Do you think the COVID crisis is in any way an opportunity for relevant candidates who wish to make a transition to development sector, given the new scale and enormity of challenges the country is facing and will be facing?
Yeah, that's it's a very relevant question, and I'll answer it on two levels. One is that without any question, we are seeing a lot of interest on the part of professionals who are simply not going to sit back and accept what is going on around us, right? So in various ways, they are reaching out to me, to others who are operating in the space to see what they can do to make a difference. Is it, if a professional transition is possible? It's also in an odd way being enabled by the fact that people are spending so much time with themselves. When they're not commuting, they're not stuck in traffic jams, they're not traveling. And, so there is this time of reflection, time and space of reflection, which is prompting a lot of people to think about their own mission and purpose and, what means the most to them. So that's driving a lot of interest. That's without any question. I think on the demand side, there are some challenges. Because businesses have suffered so hugely because of the economic impact of the crisis. Generally speaking, there is less money to give on the CSR side in particular. A lot of individuals have seen a huge erosion in their wealth because the markets have crashed. So in general, I see a fair, shrinking in the organizations that are operating in the space in their budgets, and obviously that has an impact on hiring. So I would say it's a great time to think about it. It may not be the exact right time to set the aspiration to actually find an opportunity or land an opportunity, but it's a great time to think about it and use the time to kind of build and deepen your understanding about the sector and position yourself well so that when there is economic recovery and the money flows into the sector are in a better place, that you're well positioned to transition.
I have one last question for you, Moomal. Many professionals look for opportunities in the social sector in their search for meaning in life. Do people who make such transition find fulfillment and meaning in their lives?
Okay, so this meaning is a very big word. In my experience, I've found that meaning is actually it when you unpack it, it comprises of 3 or 4 things. One is that there is a dipping learning curve in whatever it is that they are doing. They feel like even if they change a job within the corporate sector, it's going to be a little bit more of the same. The second is that there is some degree of financial freedom. So the mind space to explore meaning is present. And the third thing is that a lot of people are thinking about issues of legacy and impact in terms of, the work that I do, the work that I spend 12, 13, 14 hours a day doing. What is it really doing? Who is it changing what for? And when you juxtapose it against the world that we are living in now, where there is so much inequity, I think those are very, very relevant questions. I think it works best for people, this transition and these questions work best for people where, they are able to draw a little bit of distance between the bonus and the work visits of a corporate job and the business class travel and so on. I think when they have that readiness, then there is space to explore issues of new learning, unlearning, reorienting towards impact, and to embracing a new type of domain and contribution.
Thank you, Moomal. There is a lot of appreciation coming on the comment section on the live feed. People are calling it as an insightful session as well as a very candid session. So thank you very much for taking the time and doing this for us. And I hope all of you viewers have enjoyed Moomal's insights, whether between your time or your money. And I also loved it so much. Thank you so much, Moomal.
Thank you, Sushant.
Yeah. And for viewers who are watching, Living My Promise conducts this Facebook live sessions every Saturday. Please do, keep checking our page, like our page, www.facebook.com/livingmypromise. Follow our page and stay tuned. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.